Now I would like to present a different view of memory from the one that we just discussed. We have just looked at the Atkinson and Shiffrin model of memory, where we have sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Now this is a different theory of memory, the current one, and it was advanced by Larry Squire, who's a neuropsychologist, and he differentiated memory between declarative memory, also known as explicit, and non-declarative memory, also known as implicit. So declarative memory is memory for things that we are conscious of. So memory for either facts or events. Memory for facts is memory for also known as semantic memory. It's memory for factual information, like, for example, categorization. The fact that an apple is a fruit is a memory for a fact. The memory for the fact that a table and a chair are related to each other, that's also memory for fact. The other type of this conscious, explicit, declarative memory is memory for events, also known as episodic memory. So this will be memory for episodes of our own life. Like, for example, what you had for breakfast this morning is memory of an event that happened to you. On the other hand, we have a host of memories that are non-declarative or implicit, which occurs without conscious awareness, ranging from non-associative type of learning, like, for example, habituation, the fact that we stop responding to stimuli after repeated exposure. Simple classical conditioning is a type of non-declarative memory. So we remember that, let's say, the bell came before the food. So whenever we are exposed to the bell, we expect the food to come. So we have to remember that. So it is a type of memory. We have priming, which is the fact that when we are exposed to some information, we can process the same information more easily at a later time. Right? So again, that is based on memory, because we need to remember, even though not consciously, that we have been exposed to that information in order to process it better. And finally, we have memory for skills and habits, which means we remember, for example, how to do things, how to ride a bike, how to play tennis, how to ski, how to cook a meal. Right? Again, all these memories that are not necessarily our usual, type of thinking about memory, but are unique because they don't require our conscious awareness. All right, so here you have listed the number of information related, again, to explicit versus implicit memory, episodic versus semantic memory. Episodic is more autobiographical, semantic is just general knowledge about the world. And implicit memory, like procedural, priming. We also have this differentiation between retrospective and prospective memory. We tend to believe that memory is only relating to the past. It turns out that memory is also related to the future. I believe I mentioned that in one of the previous slides, right, that memory is not only recalling from the past, like episodic, semantic, or even implicit memories, but also projecting onto the future. When we remember to do things in the future, like, for example, we have to stop and buy apples at the grocery store on your way home. When you go home, you have to remember to stop and buy apples in order for that to happen. And this, may fail due to preoccupation or distractions. An interesting aspect of memory is what are called flashbulb memories, memories for events that are emotionally stirring and important to us. And we appear to have a much better memory, at least in terms of the way we feel and we experience those memories individually. We believe that those memories are much better than any other memory. So, for example, memory for events like 9/11, for the one of you who are old enough to have experienced 9/11 as a relatively traumatic event here in the United States, you probably believe exactly what you were doing and you know, that particular day when it happens, and even though it's now, you know, a number of years ago. Now, probably the reason why we remember better this type of information is because these type of memories are more distinctive. They are more unique. If you remember from our previous discussion, the type of information that interfere the most with memories are similar information. So when you have a lot of the same information, it's difficult to distinguish among all of those memories. On the other hand, when you have a memory for information that's very unique, for some very unique material, you know, like 9/11, for example, you know, how many other experiences have you had that are similar to 9/11? Hopefully none, right? So that's a very unique event, and because it's so distinctive, it's more easily remembered. Also, when we discussed elaborative memory, elaborative rehearsal previously, as you remember, that we are able to remember information better whenever we think about it more, whenever we elaborate on it. The reason why that's the case is because it is believed that we have an increased number of network association. So the more we think about a particular event, the more likely we are to connect that event with something else that we already know, creating a connection there, right? So, for example, when you think about 9/11, you might think about the way you felt about 9/11, so you make a connection with that thing. You might remember the people you were with, so you make a connection there. Some other people that you might know who lived in New York City at the time, and so you make another connection there. And all of this connection increase the likelihood that you're going to be able to get back to that information because of the connection you made previously. And this, as you remember, is called elaborative rehearsal. So elaborative rehearsal increases the network of association. In addition to it, when we experience an emotionally stirring event, the stress hormone is released, and stress hormone increase memories. So whenever, you know, everything else being equal, whenever we remember something under a stressful that is stressful in nature, we're gonna remember it better, and that's because the stress hormone cortisol increases the memory, the strength of the memory. And if you think about it, it's very useful, right? Because it would be very important for us to remember something that is emotionally stirring, right? Much more important than something that is not emotionally stirring, that didn't produce any emotional reaction, right? So it's very adaptive from an evolutionary perspective to remember things that are emotionally stirring better than other memories. One of the phenomena that many of us, probably all of us, experience is the tip of the tongue phenomenon, which is a feeling of knowing. Have you ever experienced, like, for example, knowing that you know some information but you can't quite remember it at that particular point in time? And a lot of people experience tip of the tongue phenomenon when they're taking an exam. You know that you know some information, but at that time it doesn't come to you. Perhaps you leave the examination room on your way home, there it comes, you know, and now you have it. And so this is actually an interesting phenomenon, because it is supportive to the idea that we have discussed before, that once information are in long-term memory, they might be there forever. So you might never lose that information, and perhaps the reason why you can't remember it is because you can't find it. So you have the information, it's there somewhere, you can't find it at that particular time, but some other, you know, sometime later it might come back to you. So cues are important in retrieving the information. Someone might give you, oh, the name begins with, let's say you can't remember a name that you know, but someone says, oh yeah, the name of that person. Okay, let me give you a cue. It begins with the letter O, and it's a short name, right? And then you'll be able to realize what it is. And it may reflect incomplete learning. Maybe you didn't process the information completely or correctly, and it's going to be problematic for you to bring it back out when you need to. There's also a phenomena known as context dependent and state dependent memory. What does that mean? That memory is dependent upon the context in which you are in. You remember information better if the context is the same when you're trying to remember it as it was when you stored the information away. Right? So let's say you study in a particular room, you remember better information if you try to remember the information in that particular room. I'm sure many of you have experienced a situation where, let's say you spent a lot of time, you know, when you were a kid in a particular location, but you haven't been there in a long time. If you go back to that location, all of these memories come back to you, right? Let's say you don't go to grandma's house that often, but when you go there, all of a sudden, all of these memories of what happened in the past in that house comes back to you. So that's context. And it's similar to, in a way, state dependent, which suggests that memory is better when your state is the same. Talking about biological state as well as emotional state. So when you are, for example, in a particular emotional state, like when you're happy, you're going to remember better information that you have learned in the past when you were happy. When you are sad and depressed, you remember information better about your past, which were sad and depressed. So an interesting phenomena. Also, when an individual is altered by some psychoactive drugs, for example, so there's a biological component to it, that particular individual, let's say they remember they store away some information under the influence of alcohol, they're going to remember it better when they are again under the influence of alcohol, right? So both a biological as well as an emotional tied to memory. But the key point here to remember is that there has to be a match between when or where the information, or in which condition the information was acquired, and re-establishing the same condition when you're trying to remember the information. Now, let me give you another example that might illustrate this better. You know, you are in a kitchen and you're doing something in the kitchen and you need to get something in the garage. So you leave the kitchen, you go to the garage. When you get there, you forgot what you were there to do. Right? Why am I here? Now, what is the first thing that you're going to do in order to remember what you went to the garage to do? You go back to the kitchen. So re-establish the same environment, the context, right? So even though you might not be familiar with the context-dependent model of memory or phenomena, you still know that what you have to do in order to remember better. Now, interference, as we mentioned before, one of the leading cause of a loss of memory, when information interferes with other information you're trying to remember. And interference happens in two ways. There can be a retroactive interference, retro, right, going back in time, and proactive interference going forward. So retroactive information is when new information interferes with your ability to remember old learning, like old information, right? So the interference goes backward in time. On the other hand, you can have a situation in which older information interferes with the capacity to retrieve more recently learned material with newer information. So if you learned something in sociology last week that prevents you from remembering what you have learned in psychology yesterday, that would be an example of proactive interference. It goes from last week to yesterday. On the other hand, the opposite can also happen. You might learn something today that prevents you from remembering what you have learned last month in philosophy, right? So that would be an example of retroactive interference. So interference can happen in any direction. And of course, there's a problem with memory. So that's an amnesia. So any memory disorder, any memory problems is referred to as an amnesia. And amnesia or loss of memory can occur going forward or going backward in time. Again, anterograde and retrograde types of amnesia. And the key point to remember here is where does the loss of memory occur? Does it occur after or before an event? So the most typical example of an amnesia is retrograde, the second one listed here. So retrograde amnesia goes back in time, and it typically occurs as a result of a trauma. Very typical of individuals suffering from a trauma to the head, say an accident, bump to the head, maybe a little loss of consciousness, a few minutes, and that individual will be unable to remember the minutes leading up to the accident. So they will not be able to remember what happened immediately before that trauma. So the amnesia goes backward in time, right? The amnesia goes before the trauma, so it's retrograde in nature. Sometimes some damage, like for example, physical trauma to the brain, we discussed before, I believe earlier in the semester, a situation in which individuals need to be operated on, and parts of their brain might be removed due to some condition, and in some situation anterograde amnesia can occur where after the surgery, after the brain surgery, an individual might be unable to remember events as well. So their memory for the past might be intact, but any new memory are difficult to be created. So that would be an example of anterograde amnesia, where the problem with memory occurs after the fact, after, in this particular case, the surgery.